Imagine this. You're driving alone late at night on an isolated road and the snowstorm around you thickens. Visibility is almost gone. The cold is biting, and every mile feels like you're sinking deeper into a nightmare. Now, picture yourself coming across a figure standing in the middle of that blizzard, needing help. Would you stop? Could you stop? Asterisk tonight. We delve into one of the most chilling stories I've ever come across. A terrifying tale of desperation, isolation, and the haunting consequences of a single decision. This is the story of the hitchhiker in the blizzard. It was start of December, one of the coldest winters the region had ever seen. Sam, a 32-year-old truck driver, was used to long, lonely drives through unforgiving weather. But this night was different. The storm wasn't just bad, it was brutal. Thick snow coated the windshield despite the wipers working overtime, and the icy roads made every turn feel like a gamble. Sam had just left a small diner off Route 27. The waitress had warned him about the incoming blizzard, but he had laughed it off. He had driven through worse, or so he thought. 30 minutes into the drive, the road became nearly impassable. The silence of the blizzard was deafening, broken only by the occasional groan of his truck struggling against the icy winds. That's when he saw it. Through the haze of the storm, a figure appeared on the side of the road, barely visible in the glow of his headlights. A man, hunched over, clutching a duffel bag, waving frantically. Sam's heart raced. He knew stopping in weather like this could be dangerous, but leaving someone out there felt even worse. Against his better judgment, he slowed down and rolled down the passenger window. "Need a lift?" Sam shouted over the howling wind. The man didn't answer. He simply opened the door and climbed in, bringing a gust of frigid air with him. The man was pale, his face gaunt and shadowed by a tattered hood. He looked like he hadn't eaten or slept in days. "Thanks," the man muttered, his voice barely audible. He set his bag on the floor and stared straight ahead, not meeting Sam's gaze. Sam tried to make conversation as they drove. "Rough night to be out here. Where you headed?" "North," the man replied curtly. His voice was flat, emotionless. Something about him didn't sit right with Sam. Maybe it was the man's refusal to talk, or the way he clutched the duffel bag like it was his lifeline. Sam glanced at the bag. It looked old, worn, but oddly stained. The storm worsened, and the truck felt like it was being swallowed by the night. The hitchhiker sat motionless, his eyes fixed on the snowy abyss outside. Sam couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, even though the man never turned his head. As the miles stretched on, the silence became unbearable. Sam attempted another conversation. "So, what's in the bag?" he asked, trying to sound casual. The hitchhiker finally turned to him, his eyes cold and piercing. "Something important," he said. Then, after a long pause, he added, "Something that doesn't belong to me." Sam's grip tightened on the wheel. "What do you mean?" he asked cautiously. The man didn't answer. Instead, he leaned back in his seat and closed his eyes, as if the conversation was over. The unease in the truck was suffocating. Every shadow outside seemed to move. Every gust of wind sounded like a whisper. Sam's instincts screamed at him to stop and make the man leave. But the storm made that impossible. An hour later, they reached a narrow bridge over a frozen river. The truck slowed as Sam carefully navigated the icy planks. Halfway across, the hitchhiker spoke again, his voice softer this time. "You shouldn't have picked me up," he said. Sam's chest tightened. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice trembling. The man turned to him, his face pale but his eyes different. They seemed hollow, lifeless. "Because now it's too late," he whispered. Before Sam could react, the truck jolted violently. The rear tire skidded on the ice, and the vehicle spun sideways, coming to a stop just inches from the edge of the bridge. The engine sputtered and died, plunging them into darkness. Panic surged through Sam as he tried to restart the truck, but it was no use. He turned to the hitchhiker, but the man was gone. The passenger seat was empty. Sam's breath quickened. He grabbed a flashlight and stepped out into the storm, shouting for the hitchhiker. His voice echoed into the night, swallowed by the howling wind. That's when he saw the footprints. A single set of tracks leading away from the truck, heading down toward the frozen river below. Against his better judgment, Sam followed them. The tracks led him to the center of the frozen river, where they abruptly stopped. No sign of the hitchhiker, no sign of anything. Just an expanse of ice stretching into the darkness. Sam shined his flashlight around, his breath visible in the freezing air. Then he heard it, a faint, raspy whisper. "Help me." The voice was coming from beneath the ice. Sam dropped to his knees, his flashlight trembling in his hands. Peering down, he saw a face staring back at him from beneath the surface, a face that looked exactly like the hitchhiker's. The frozen figure's mouth moved, forming silent words. Sam scrambled back, his heart pounding. Suddenly, the ice beneath him cracked. Before he could react, the ground gave way, and he plunged into the freezing water. The last thing he saw before blacking out was the hitchhiker's lifeless eyes staring into his own. Sam's truck was found days later, abandoned on the bridge. The authorities assumed he had gotten lost in the storm and succumbed to the elements. But the locals tell a different story. A story of a cursed hitchhiker who roams the roads during blizzards, looking for his next ride. And if you're ever driving alone on a snowy night, remember this. Not everyone you see is looking for help. Some are looking for something far more sinister. Asterisk. So, would you stop for a stranger in a blizzard? Or would you keep driving? Knowing what you know now, that choice might just save your life or cost you everything. Asterisk. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more chilling tales. And remember, the scariest stories are the ones that could happen to anyone, even you. Sleep well, if you can. Winter getaways are supposed to be a time for peace, a break from the noise of everyday life. But sometimes, in the stillness of the snow-covered world, we discover things that were never meant to be disturbed. This is the story of Emily and Jack, a couple who thought a remote cabin by a frozen lake would be the perfect retreat, until they realized they were not alone. Asterisk. Emily and Jack had been planning this trip for months. They were both city people, used to the constant buzz of traffic and flashing lights. The idea of spending a few days in a secluded cabin, surrounded by nature and silence, sounded like paradise. The cabin was everything they had hoped for. Cozy, rustic, and perched on the edge of a vast, frozen lake. Snow blanketed the area, and the only sounds were the occasional rustle of trees and the soft creaking of the lake's frozen surface. It was perfect, or so they thought. On their first day, they met the cabin owner, an elderly man named Mr. Harris. He handed over the keys and gave them a brief tour, his weathered face etched with an expression that bordered on unease. "Stay off the lake at night," he said abruptly as he turned to leave. Jack laughed. "Why, will the ice monster get us?" Mr. Harris didn't smile. "Just don't. There are things better left undisturbed." The couple dismissed his warning as an old man superstition. That evening, Emily and Jack enjoyed their first dinner in the cabin. The fire crackled in the stone fireplace, and the warm glow of candles filled the room. Afterward, they stepped outside to admire the view. The frozen lake stretched endlessly under the moonlight, its surface glistening like glass. As they stood there, Jack spotted something unusual. "Do you see that?" he asked, pointing. Emily squinted. Near the center of the lake was a faint shadow, something small and humanoid in shape. It didn't move, and they couldn't make out any details from the shore. "It's probably just a tree branch or something frozen in the ice," Emily said. brushing it off. But Jack couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The next morning, the couple woke to find the world outside transformed by fresh snowfall. The untouched snow was pristine, except for a set of footprints leading from the lake to the cabin. The prints were strange. They weren't boot-shaped like a person's, but elongated, almost claw-like. "Must be some kind of animal," Jack said, though his voice betrayed uncertainty. Emily frowned. What kind of animal walks in a straight line like that? They followed the prints, which stopped abruptly a few feet from the cabin's front door. No tracks led away, as if whatever had made them had simply disappeared. That night, the unease grew. As they sat by the fire, Emily thought she heard faint scratching at the windows. She dismissed it as branches swaying in the wind, but when she looked outside, the trees were completely still. Jack decided to step out for some air, and Emily stayed behind. Moments later, she heard him shouting, "Emily, come here." She rushed outside and found him standing at the edge of the lake, staring out at the ice. The shadow they had seen the night before had moved. It was closer to the shore now, its outline clearer. It was unmistakably humanoid, and its head seemed to be tilted, as if it were watching them. "We need to go back inside," Emily said, her voice trembling. Jack hesitated, but eventually followed her. They locked the doors and windows, though they couldn't explain why they felt the need to. The following morning, they discovered deep scratches on the cabin's front door, as if something had tried to claw its way in. "That's it," Emily said. "We're leaving today." Jack agreed, but when he tried to start the car, it wouldn't turn over. The battery was dead, even though it had been fine the day before. They were stranded. As the day wore on, the tension in the cabin became unbearable. Emily swore she heard faint whispers coming from the direction of the lake. Jack tried to rationalize it, saying it was just the wind. But as night fell, the whispers grew louder, and the shadow was now just feet from the shore. The final night was the worst. Around midnight, they were jolted awake by a loud thud on the roof. Jack grabbed a flashlight and cautiously climbed onto a chair to look through the small attic window. "Emily," he whispered, his voice shaking. "It's on the roof." Emily didn't need to ask what it was. They could hear the slow, deliberate scraping of claws on the wooden shingles. Suddenly, the noise stopped and a deafening silence filled the cabin. Then, a loud crash came from the kitchen. They rushed to the doorway and froze. The figure from the lake was inside the cabin. It stood unnaturally tall, its body a mix of ice and shadow. Its face was featureless except for two hollow voids where eyes should have been. It let out a low, guttural sound and began moving toward them. Jack grabbed a fire poker and swung it wildly, but the figure seemed unaffected. Desperate, Emily threw a lantern at it, and the light caused the entity to recoil briefly, giving them just enough time to run outside. They didn't stop running until they reached the main road, where they flagged down a passing snowplow. The driver took them to safety, but when they explained what had happened, he simply nodded grimly. "You're not the first," he said. "That lake has a history. They say a man drowned there years ago, and his spirit lingers, angry at anyone who disturbs his rest." Emily and Jack never returned to the cabin, and to this day, they can't look at a frozen lake without feeling a deep, inexplicable fear. Sometimes, the most peaceful places hold the darkest secrets. Emily and Jack learned the hard way that not all warnings should be ignored. The shadow on the frozen lake was more than just a trick of the light. It was a reminder that some things are better left undisturbed. If you ever find yourself in a remote cabin, surrounded by snow and silence, remember this story. And whatever you do, don't go near the lake at night. Winter nights are meant to be serene. A blanket of white snow muffles the world, leaving behind an eerie stillness. But sometimes, The quiet can be deceptive, masking dangers hidden beneath the frost. Tonight, I'll take you to an isolated town buried under relentless snowfall. A town where something or someone waits under the snow. Stay close, because this story might make you think twice before stepping out alone on a winter's night. Rachel, a 28-year-old nurse who recently moved to an isolated town called Frost Peak. Nestled in the mountains, Frost Peak is known for its harsh winters and long, lonely nights. Rachel's new house, a modest cabin at the edge of the forest, seemed perfect at first, a peaceful escape from her hectic life. But peace turned into unease on her very first night. As she sat by the window, sipping hot cocoa, the storm outside intensified. Snow fell in thick sheets, turning the world outside into a swirling void. The wind howled like a mournful spirit. Just as Rachel was about to close the curtains, she noticed something. A figure standing motionless near the edge of the forest. It was too far to make out any details, but it was definitely a person. What caught her attention was how still they were, despite the brutal weather. She squinted, trying to discern more, but the snow blurred her vision. When she looked again, the figure was gone. A shiver ran down her spine, and it wasn't from the cold. The storm subsided by morning, leaving behind a pristine white expanse. Curious and slightly unsettled, Rachel decided to check the spot where she'd seen the figure. As she trudged through the snow, she found something chilling. Footprints. They weren't just random tracks. They formed a circle as if the person had been pacing. But the most disturbing part, the prints led straight to her cabin's back door and then vanished. No prints leading away. Rachel felt the hairs on her neck stand up. Who or what had been outside her home in the middle of the storm? The following nights were restless for Rachel. She began hearing faint scratching sounds at her windows, even on the second floor. It couldn't be animals, not in this weather and not at that height. One night, as she lay in bed, she heard the faint crunch of snow. Someone was outside. Gathering her courage, she peeked through the blinds. At first, she saw nothing but the snowy yard illuminated by moonlight. Then, a shadow shifted. The figure was back. They were closer now, standing just beyond her porch. Rachel's breath caught in her throat. The figure seemed to stare directly at her, though its face was obscured by a hood. She quickly shut the blinds, her heart racing. When she dared to look again, the figure was gone, but something new had appeared. Etched into the snow in large, jagged letters. Asterisk, come closer. Asterisk. Imagine being alone, surrounded by miles of snow-covered wilderness, and knowing that someone or something is watching you. Rachel wasn't just scared. She was trapped, and the worst was yet to come. Rachel decided to confide in the town's only police officer, Deputy Harris. She described the footprints, the figure, and the chilling message. Harris was skeptical, but agreed to investigate. Together, they searched the area surrounding her cabin, but found no clues. As they were about to leave, Harris paused. His gaze was fixed on the forest. "Did you hear that?" he asked. Rachel strained her ears. At first, all she could hear was the wind. Then, faintly, a voice, soft and whispery, almost like a child's, calling her name. "Rachel, Rachel." It echoed through the trees, sending chills down her spine. At this point, Rachel should have left Frost Peak. But sometimes, curiosity can be more dangerous than fear. She wanted answers, and she was about to get them. That night, Rachel stayed awake, armed with a flashlight and a kitchen knife. The scratching returned, louder this time, summoning her courage. She flung the curtains open. The figure was standing on her porch. This time, she could see more details. The hood was tattered, and beneath it was a pale, gaunt face with hollow eyes that seemed to glow faintly in the dark. It raised a hand and pointed to the forest. Before Rachel could react, the figure turned and began to walk away, leaving deep footprints in the snow. Against her better judgment, she decided to follow. Grabbing her coat, she stepped outside. The figure led her deep into the woods, where the trees grew thicker and the air colder. Finally, it stopped in a small clearing. Rachel's flashlight flickered, casting eerie shadows. In the center of the clearing was a mound of snow, unnaturally smooth and perfectly round. The figure stood beside it, motionless. "Who are you?" Rachel demanded, her voice trembling. The figure slowly raised a hand and pointed at the mound. Rachel hesitated but felt compelled to approach. She brushed the snow away, revealing something horrifying, a frozen body, its face contorted in terror. Before she could scream, the figure whispered in a voice that sounded like ice cracking. "Asterisk, you're next. Asterisk." Rachel fled back to her cabin, locking every door and window. She called Deputy Harris, but when he arrived, the clearing was gone, buried under fresh snow. There were no signs of the figure or the body. Rachel's story spread through Frost Peak, but most dismissed it as hysteria. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Weeks later, a new resident moved into the cabin, unaware of its dark history. The last thing they found before the snowstorm cut them off from the world was a message etched into the frost on their window. Asterisk, come closer. Asterisk, answers. Who was the stranger under the snow? Was it a ghost, a warning, or something far worse? One thing is certain. Frost Peak keeps its secrets. Some stories leave you with more questions than buried, just like the snow buries its dead. So, the next time you hear footsteps in the snow, ask yourself, are they coming closer to you or leading you somewhere you don't want to go? Sleep tight